What happens in the air stays in the air, till now.
The 550 miles an hour Qantas 707 jetliner will save a full day's flying time between Sydney and London.
Let's face it, Australia is at the arse end of the world. It's a long way from anywhere else. And to get a new plane that can actually travel twice the speed of anything that had previously flown was pretty exciting. Not only was it exciting that it just went fast, but it created a whole new type of traveller who was flying not for business, but chasing pleasure.
And people wanted to be seen getting off those 707s because they were a gorgeous-looking aeroplane and they represented the new breed, faster, sleeker, and the people seemed to become faster and sleeker to match the aeroplane.
John F. Kennedy defeated GOP standard-bearer Richard Nixon, one of the closest presidential elections on record. As the communist barrier between East and West Berlin grows higher and stronger,
At the dawn of a decade of sweeping change, the babies born after World War II were hitting their teens. In Australia, there were plenty of jobs and more time for leisure and pleasure.
The baby boomers are the first generation who have grown up in a culture of abundance and leisure in a way that their parents and grandparents simply hadn't enjoyed, and the world is their oyster. They're going to play.
And now to celebrate, everybody on the floor taking the tune from Australia's latest dance craze.
They go down, they control the ladies and steal the scene.
When the first women from the generation that would shake up their country left school, they still had far fewer work choices than men. Highly prized among them was a job as an air hostess.
I think it's a job that people are a little fascinated about because of all the stories that you hear. They're not all true.
You could be a teacher, a nurse, a secretary, which I was for a while, or an air hostess.
It opened up the world to you. It was fantastic to have a job that was tremendous fun and someone paid you to travel the world. What more could you want?
We'd have breakfast in Athens, lunch in Rome and dinner in Paris.
Seeing them all in airports, you know, I just used to think, wow, if only.
And I think every girl worth a salt in those days would say, oh, I'd love to be one of those.
An air hostess's career promised opportunity and glamour, but it came with tight constraints. In the 60s, before in-flight movies, the hostesses themselves were considered entertainment. They had to be poised, charming, attractive, and conversational. The rules were spelled out in the training room.
Future glamour girls of the Skyways. A select group train as air hostesses for an Australian airline.
This is a Qantas training school manual from 1963. It's very precious.
Wow.
Do you recognise any of this, Jessica?
Certainly some of the headings are very reminiscent of exactly what I went through in 1972.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't change much through the decades. When you were in the uniform, you behaved like you should be, and you're taught to be. So yes, lots of rules about that, and we all obeyed them.
Bending and stooping.
You just had to be aware that many, many eyes were looking at you.
All femininity vanishes when a lass is perched on a desk or table or used as an aircraft seat or wall as a leaning post.
That's really quite sweet.
OK, I'm going to try sitting in a chair.
OK. Deportment, sitting in a chair. Walk towards chair and turn. Once having turned, the back of the chair can be felt. Adjust straight skirt. Bend knees and sit on edge. Slide back so that your seat touches the back of the chair. If seat is well back, shoulders automatically are straight.
How'd I do?
Perfect. Very good. You've passed.
Good.
The training was a bit of a shock, actually, and you were very tightly managed for appearance.
This is the deportment room. Here the girls learn how to look after themselves.
We had to dress all the same. We had to have the same lipstick. And someone of my complexion wearing bright pink did look rather ridiculous.
Show your nails. Make sure they were properly groomed. Or I think a bit more colour there, Wendy, please. Yes, miss.
Your hairstyle had to be approved by the hostess support supervisor. And if it was not approved, you had to wear a wig.
So, of all the rules, what was the hardest one to follow?
For many of the women, and it was only the women, it was the scales and the weighing.
You'd be weighed, and then you had to wear a girdle, and if you looked a little tubby around the waist, they'd ask you, do you have your girdle on?
I recall that I had put on a little bit of weight. I was 9 stone at the time, and they asked me to lose 3 pounds or I would not be able to go online and fly.
We were given diets specifically, and we had a couple of months to lose the weight. And if you didn't lose the weight, well, then you lost your job.
The male stewards were never weighed. Like all working women, hostesses were paid 75% of the basic male wage. Right across Australian life, men, mostly older and almost all white, ruled.
When there was 1 girl and 10 guys, I mean, if she didn't like any of the guys, I said, oh, she's a dyke. And if she did fancy one of the guys, I said she was a tart. You know, the girl couldn't win.
It was interesting because the pilots and the stewards in many ways were very protective of the flight hostesses, but they were also up to knocking on the door late at night and kind of expecting a little bit of a hello.
A knock, yes. Yes, didn't answer it, made sure the door was bolted, turned all the lights off, that sort of thing.
Air hostessing was a very gendered form of work. It really relied on the idea that women were the natural caregivers, that they were the ones who would make you feel comfortable. It also helped that they were glamorous, that they were good looking, that they conformed to conventional ideas about femininity, because this kept people happy in the air as well. So the hostess was like your wife, but a perfect version of your wife.
We weren't allowed to be married, engaged, and it was, you know, a limited career in those days.
The hostesses were on the aircraft to appeal to the men, and that in which case, if you were married, you wouldn't be as appealing.
I think she fancies me.
Airlines and other businesses rushed to fulfil the desires of the baby boomers. They were on their way to becoming Australia's most affluent generation. In the 1960s, Australia had 3 major airlines. TAA and Ansett flew locally, Qantas overseas. All used their hostesses to sell seats. One of them was Ansett hostie Susan Jones.
They wanted to use just a normal girl. It was a 2-page spread. How can 2 airlines be the same? We've got Susan Jones. I'd never had any experience with...
The ad makers glamorised a conventional Susan Jones. But she, and many other young women, were already breaking the moulds that had shaped their mothers. For many, the revolution started with hemlines. When British model Jean Shrimpton flew in for the Melbourne Cup in 1965, she packed a miniskirt.
It hit the world like a bombshell. Some people were shocked. I thought, look at those legs, I wish I could do that.
A lineup of nimble knees shows that the hem has risen to a point of no return.
Jean brought a taste of the swinging 60s to Australia.
You're looking very glamorous.
Thank you. As you did. So this was the TAA uniform, right?
Yes, it was.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like stepping into this outfit?
It was very exciting because finally we had something that we thought was very fashionable. Most of the uniforms for the flight attendants in earlier times were rather military looking. It was the first time that we'd had the choice in colour. It was a very modern design, and of course we loved our boots. And they were definitely made for walking because we walked and walked and walked all the time.
The miniskirt is almost a kind of visual symbol of the sexual liberation and sexual revolution worldwide, and I think the flight attendant is kind of signifying some of that social change that's happening.
All the Australian airlines created their own version of the mini-skirted hostess. It is a mini-skirt, isn't it?
Yes, it is, compared to what we used to have beforehand. So, Justine, just pretend that you're putting a gentleman's jacket in the hat rack.
Yes. Oh, I see.
Wow.
We're getting...
I'm sure it was very popular with the passengers.
From flight crew uniforms to romantic destinations, airlines used the promise of sex to sell flights. In the late 1960s, Qantas came up with this one.
Take it off for Fiji. It's easy. And take it off again for Sydney, Austria. To say the least, Qantas has the most takeoffs to the South Pacific. And that's why it's easy to take off with Qantas, Australia's round-the-world airline.
There was a layer of truth to the crude images. Taboos around sex were among the first of their parents' rules rejected by boomers.
But in those days, we all wanted to get away from home and party hard. I was a young girl. We'd met a group of international golfers on a flight and had a big party. In the next minute, I found I was pregnant. So I thought, what to do? One of my friends took me to the senior regional hostess who was in charge of us, and she was very kind. And in those days, the only doctor that would perform terminations was Dr. Heath in Collins Street. I think I was very lucky because I knew I didn't want a child, and it was only because of the senior regional hostess in Adelaide. She said she helped many girls.
Oh, gosh, yes. Yes, they used to name me as next of kin. Oh, dear. But, so their families wouldn't find out.
Susan Jones was lucky. Conservative estimates suggest that illegal terminations killed at least 10 women a year in the 1960s. And each year, thousands of unmarried mothers gave up their babies for adoption.
The oldest and strongest taboos are falling one by one. Girls used to be warned, it's the woman who pays.
But some Australian women were able to take control of their own fertility. The contraceptive pill had arrived in 1961. Officially, it was for married women only, and airlines insisted their hostesses were single.
I know some of the girls had problems going to some doctors, but all the girls would talk, so we knew which doctor to go to.
I think for some women taking the pill, it was a double-edged sword because especially if you were single and you were taking the pill, there was the assumption by some men that you were necessarily available.
As well as restricting fertility, the pill could control irregular periods and prevent acne. Some Australian airlines encouraged their hostesses to go on the pill.
One girl who was quite a devout Catholic, they told her she had to go on the pill to help the acne. So she was quite devastated, and the more she worried about it, the worse the acne got, so she eventually left.
The pill back in the 60s was 60 times stronger than it is now, and it caused a lot of women to become infertile. Qantas put me on the pill because of irregular periods, and it ended up with me getting thrombosis and being medically discharged from the company.
I can only speak for myself. I guess it was liberating. I didn't want to be pregnant because I knew I'd have to leave flying. It was a good thing to be on.
The pill, the miniskirt, the jet. A heady cocktail. But what other changes did they foreshadow in the air and on the ground?
Being one of the most advanced architectural creations in the world, it'll also be one of the most expensive.
Some have used these drugs to journey into the uncharted tunnels of the mind.
The 60s came to embody a new kind of hedonism. And with access to the world's hippest cities, flight crews became key players in bringing the Cultural Revolution back home.
Purely and simply because of what we did and where we were at the time, we were ahead of the curve. Like Carnaby Street in the 60s, for example, that social revolution that occurred there, we were exposed to that before it ever really got to Australia.
Sex, drugs and rock and roll. It was just, I loved every minute of it.
Aviation brought the 60s social revolution to Australia almost instantly. We weren't just reading about it, now we were part of the action.
The Rolling Stones, an English rock and roll group, are greeted with an ecstasy of sound wherever they go.
These are the same steps the Beatles walked down when they came to Australia. They flew in and faced an hysterical mob of teenage girls. If you couldn't afford a concert ticket, the next best thing was hanging out with hundreds of other screaming fans at the airport. Pretty much the same sound you got at the concert anyway.
Just trying to stay on their feet, soaking up the rain and the adulation.
We crewed the flight from Brisbane to Sydney with them. I did get all their autographs, and then I gave it to someone by mistake. I regretted that later.
The new music was the soundtrack to social change. Although not for everyone. In the 1960s, homosexuality was a crime for which men were often arrested and prosecuted. All but a few very brave gay men and women lived in the closet.
On my second interview, I was speaking to the receptionist, and she said, look, you did very well in the last interview, but here's a tip for you. Don't cross your ankles. Scratch your balls and know the football scores. Well, in the 60s, basically, there was, gay people were kind of second-rate citizens. They really were, and I mean, it just didn't fit in with the norm.
I got married to a lovely young lady, and I did break this lady's heart, and it's something I've always, 50 years later, I still think of it and think I wished I hadn't. That's the one thing I wished I hadn't done in my life. But I was married when I joined Qantas. The straight boys, which were the majority of male crew, they adopted me as one of them. And of course, it didn't take me long to be dealing with very, very lovely gay men, and I very quickly joined forces. And my wife and I separated, and of course the straight men never really forgave me for jumping the fence, as they said, as if one had a choice.
Many gay Australians chose to come out in the air.
In the early days of flying, you just sort of go away on a 21-day trip, and you'd be coming back to the jet base, and then someone up the back would pipe up, oh, mate, 21 days away, no fucking poofs. Am I allowed to swear? And so when that first happened, I just sort of shriveled up inside. And then it happened a couple of times more until finally I thought, right, that's enough. And so I said, well, wrong, put my hand up, and a couple of other guys did as well, because no one talked about it, especially in those early days.
The service industry, hotel industry, the airline industry, and maybe the nursing industry, you were sort of tolerated. You weren't accepted, you were tolerated.
Even though gay people had to live a closeted type life, we felt so much more comfortable in places like San Francisco and New York and London because there was really a huge crowd of us. Yeah, so the bars were wonderful and, you know, they had saunas and they had sex clubs. It was a very interesting period pre-AIDS, it really was.
In the bohemian cities they could fly to, gay men were finding safe places. But in Australia, on the ground, straight males ran almost every workplace. And the powerful unions, to which over half of workers belonged. To improve their working lives, hosties had begun to unionise. In 1963, Qantas air hostesses formed their own union. They chose to represent themselves, separate from pilots, stewards, and their domestic colleagues.
Girls on the executive determined to go out and recruit. And within the space of a couple of months, we got 100% membership of the union without making it compulsory. And that was the strength of it. The strength of the union was the membership.
Negotiating their first industrial award in 1966, the Qantas hostesses started with the basics. They asked for a wage rise, rest breaks, and limits to the hours they could be made to work on long flights.
We would have ranged in age from 22 to 27. That would have been the executive of the union. So it was a very young people dealing with the arbitration court, which took themselves very seriously, and dealing with a lot of much older people in the pilot community.
Qantas agreed to give its hostesses almost everything they had demanded.
We did ourselves proud.
Despite their victory, airline hostesses still had to retire at 35 or when they married. And they still earned less than men doing the same job. The fight for equality was far from over.
The President referred to the events in Selma as an American tragedy.
Undoubtedly, demonstrations of this kind are aimed at many national figures, and in other parts of the world are often much more serious.
The 1960s was a period of incredible social and political change globally, not just happening here in Australia. And, you know, you had a highly visible civil rights movement in the United States, and Aboriginal people started to notice and read and see and hear of those events happening overseas.
It was a milestone in terms of the relationship between Australia and First Peoples. You have the 1967 referendum, which is a moment where that whole relationship is renegotiated.
In 1967, Australians voted on whether to change the constitution to allow the federal government to make laws for Aboriginal people and include them in the national census.
And you see over 90% of Australians vote yes in a referendum because they think the change will benefit Aboriginal people and that change will make the country better. So it's kind of an extraordinary moment.
They knew how many cattle and sheep were there, but they couldn't tell you how many Aboriginal people existed. I always thought that we were part of the assimilation process because eventually we were sent away to school, you know, to get a good education down south. In the senior level, leaving, they used to call leaving certificate, they give you an interview as you were leaving and you talk about what sort of career you want, what's the path you want to take. And I said air hostessing. I wanted to be an air hostess. And I can still remember to this day, this guy looking at me and saying, "You'll never be an air hostess, not your kind."
Laurel Russ became Australia's first Aboriginal air hostess in the same year as the referendum.
When I started, I made very good friends with the family that practically ran the airline in Tamworth, and they wanted me to put a story about how Indigenous people can do well. And when you're 20 or whatever, you think, of course I'll do that. But when I look back on it now, it's such a racist and sort of a discriminatory thing to do. I think they thought the Aboriginal people don't have a brain, that I wouldn't be able to survive. I mean, there were little jokes about things like keep Laurel away from the alcohol. I was so naive. I didn't think they were meaning it in a racist way. And being Aboriginal, you know, you hear the things going around that you're never going to succeed in anything. You had to prove yourself. And I think that was in the back of my mind being an air hostess. I wanted to prove I could do something equal to everyone else. And I think that was a stepping stone for the rest of my life. I did feel good.
It's important for people to see Aboriginal people in a range of roles. And it's also important for Aboriginal people to see it. Once they see Aboriginal people in different jobs, whether it's air hostessing, whether it's being a pilot, it then allows them to think bigger about what they might want to do. So it serves a range of really important purposes to be kind of breakthrough person.
All over the country, small revolutions were taking off. No one knew where Australia would land.
Take your seats for the moon. Tickets a little over £48 million each. Climax of the greatest adventure of all time.
In 1969 came human flight's greatest moment. A 385,000-kilometre journey to put a man on the moon.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And about 2 or 3 or maybe 4 easy phases can bring you to fairly smooth.
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar.
In 66 years, we'd gone from the first powered flight to footprints on the moon. A lot of talk was of the new frontier. David Bowie was floating out there and space was waiting for us. Hostesses would soon be space hosties, handing out space food sticks.
We get a good picture here, and we're wondering what you're eating down there. Yeah, right now I'm getting ready to eat some borscht.
Of course, we're still waiting to be served chicken or beef in zero gravity. A very different kind of aircraft would be the future of aviation. The discoveries and daring of the lunar missions inspired the commercial aircraft engineers, creating a monster plane. From up here, I can feel in a whole new way how big these planes really are. The Boeing 747 is twice the size as the 707. This giant leap in aircraft technology first landed in Australia in 1971, and it quickly became known as the jumbo jet. It would transform life in the air and on the ground.
But at the beginning of the jet era, if anybody had said to me that they would build an aircraft that would take 400 passengers non-stop Sydney and Los Angeles, you'd have attempted to have them certified.
The original 747 was such a revolutionary design, you could suddenly fit 2 and 3 times the number of people on board. After it was introduced, Qantas introduced fares that were half what they had been previously.
The whole industry changed absolutely completely because they needed an incredible amount of women and guys, so they hired and hired and hired. We ought to be retrained.
I loved it. Yeah, it was like a huge big room, virtually, and, you know, all the people, the numbers, and you had all the different classes, and you had the upper deck. When I started flying on that 747, the upper deck was where the first class people went up to a bar. There was a bar up there, and there was a lounge. It was a lounge area.
The 747 provided separate spaces for the pearls and suits, while a new generation of Australian travellers made themselves comfortable down the back in more casual attire.
Hey, Garcon, can I please have another couple of half dozens, or make it a dozen?
So the 747 democratises air travel because it is the moment where the mass of ordinary Australians are able to not just read about what it's like to travel around in planes, but to actually do it ourselves.
In greater numbers than ever before, ordinary Australians thrilled to flight. Some went a little wild.
People seem to have
this don't care attitude. You know, they don't apply the same rules on the ground as what they do in the air. I always wondered why, because that aluminium tube is very restrictive. And I can't tell you how many times people join the Mile High Club.
Somehow, in the air, stand-up sex in a public place was cool.
And some not so sneakily either. There were a couple out in the open with, you know, only a blanket.
The 747 offered new opportunities for love all over the plane.
Unfortunately, I remember there was a new flight attendant working first class, and she's saying, "You have to come really quick, they're doing things." And I said, okay, don't worry. So I clinked a lot of glasses on the bar and banged a few bottles down and coughed and let them know there was someone around. Very sheepish come daylight.
They had an elevator down in economy where all the meals were kept. It's called the lower lobe. And what went down on the lower lobe was nobody's business. But I opened the door one day and 7 of the guys were stark naked. And I just laughed.
First in Philbrook Air Base, they had their gun battle. The 9 hostages died, along with a policeman and 5 guerrillas.
In 1972, Gough Whitlam became Prime Minister. The baby boomers had found their king. He rode to power on a wave of change. In 1974, Gough's Labor government made it the law for employers to pay men and women the same wages for the same work.
I have my first pay slip here from 1967, $40 a week. And another one, 1974, it had risen to $99.60. But the following year, it was $170.25 a week, the Whitlam years.
Hostesses were now allowed to keep working after they married, but they were still forced to retire at 35.
I was 25 when I first started flying. And Qantas, in their wisdom, didn't want older flight attendants. They didn't want flight attendants that were going to be overweight. So they asked us to sign a contract that we would leave at 35 with a minimum of 10 years service. And it all sounded good when you're 25. And so many of us did sign that contract, and knowing that there were no promotional opportunities either, none of the women were promoted.
We dared to put up an argument that we should be allowed to be married, we should be allowed to be, you know, over the age of 30. We should be able to make it a lifetime career.
In 1975, for the first time, domestic hostesses went on strike. 1,600 hosties walked off, virtually grounding the nation. They wanted more money, the right to fly until they were 3 months pregnant, and their retirement age lifted to 45. Sir Reginald Ansett, founder and major shareholder of the domestic carrier, was furious.
It was at that stage when Sir Reginald Ansett came out and publicly said, how dare we, we're nothing but a bunch of old boilers. And I was most indignant at the time because I was the ripe old age of 20.
I thought he was mean. But he, you know, he was quite a powerful man, so I don't think it bothered him. He could say at that time whatever he wanted to.
This was a joke because none of them were over 35. Even his wife came out and said, Reg, you can't say that about these women.
But with his planes stuck on the ground, Reg caved. Only 2 days into the strike, Ansett agreed to all the hosties' demands.
And here we have it, an old boiler.
The passenger cabins of Australian aircraft were becoming fairer workplaces. One area at the front of the plane remained strictly for the boys. It wasn't called the cockpit for nothing. In 1976, after more than 50 years of civil aviation, a female pilot had never flown for a major Australian airline.
It was such a man's world. It was just such a man's world, and it was really impenetrable.
Unrepentant after his defeat by the hostesses, Reg Ansett was determined no woman would pilot his aircraft.
I didn't think anything about gender, actually. It didn't even occur to me that it would be a problem. That wasn't until I went through the selection process with Ansett. After doing interviews, after doing psychological tests, then they said, well, no, we're not taking you. One of the guys that was selected scored less than me on every single one of them. So less educated, less hours, older, all that sort of stuff. So you go, well, that doesn't sound right. So what could it be? Could only be one thing.
Deborah Laurie brought a sex discrimination claim against Ansett.
I'm determined to get this decision resolved with Ansett. Whether I get employed or not might be another thing.
Ansett argued that women were not strong enough to fly planes. Their earrings might get caught in the controls. A crash might occur due to a female pilot having an ectopic pregnancy.
There was a lot of scepticism about women driving trucks, driving trams, buses. You didn't see women doing these things back then. So an aeroplane was even worse than any of that, let alone a jet.
In a landmark case, the Equal Opportunity Tribunal ruled Ansett had discriminated against Deborah. The airline appealed the decision. But they were forced to include Deborah in their next trainee intake and barred from recruiting male pilots while the appeal was being heard.
In the meantime, Ansett couldn't hold off anymore without having pilots, so I started training with them, pending a High Court decision. Well, training, they put me in the ground school. They weren't going to let me get in an aeroplane, actually.
But with the case still before the courts, Reg Ansett was sidelined. Ansett was taken over by a consortium led by Sir Peter Abels and Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch put a memo out that came out on the following day to say that you must treat her the same as everyone else. And then 2 days later, I was in an aeroplane. Very nice.
I've always wanted to know what happens behind this curtain.
Ah, let me show you. Come this way.
Feels a little bit like backstage.
Isn't it ever? This really became a confessional box to crew. During the night, when passengers would be sleeping, we'd all gather in the galleys, and we'd call the confessional box. This was where they would just pour out their issues and the problems that they're confronted with. And the pathos and the humour that one heard over those years were enough stories to fill a library full of books.
I don't think there's too many workforces that are closed up in a cabin on an aircraft for 13 hours or more with a diverse workforce.
You go on a 21-day trip and you'd have the most fantastic time.
In the 1980s, international stopovers for crews could be up to 6 days. Party time.
It was just sort of naughty, really. The girls used to do things on the aircraft that if they'd have known about in the head office, they would have sacked us all.
So I got a reputation in Qantas. Well, when I joined in 79, I was very attracted to African American men. So I made many trips to my main route, if you pardon the pun, was... Oh, sorry, I should...
And of course, once we started going to America, that just was wonderful because the hotels were always in the middle of the city and there was an incredible gay scene.
It was a changed time, especially in the gay scene. I was completely and utterly intimidated by it. It was the check shirt and moustache brigade, and I was in body shirts and sort of, flared trousers. I was just completely out of my depth.
They used to call the male flight attendants flying mattresses.
AIDS first arrived in the minds of most Australians with this controversial ad. It showed families being mowed down by the Grim Reaper, which some people saw as the people first affected by the disease. So the AIDS epidemic was a huge shock to the gay community. It was a time of fear.
So you were flying throughout the beginnings of the AIDS epidemic. What was that like for you? What was the impact up here in the air?
Devastating, devastating. The ignorance was mind-boggling between certain crew. We had some crew that didn't touch anything that the other crew were working with because they felt they may have the dreaded disease.
The captain in Qantas, they used to say none of the male attendants are to make our lunch or our cups of teas or anything. And one of my female bosses, she just went up to the captain and said, "Oh, who's going to make your tea for you on the flight deck?" And she said, well, if you don't take it from anyone, you get it yourself.
We really didn't know, but then of course we started losing our crew and we lost many of them. And they were charming, beautiful people. And today it would just be a pill to stop all that. But it had a huge impact, a massive impact on the whole flying crew, internationally.
There's that general hysteria that was right through the populace, not just cabin crew. Yeah, we saw it firsthand.
Fred Shear and Bill Elliston were both flight attendants. They were together for 15 years.
We couldn't have been happier, actually. We played tennis, we played cards, we went on holidays together. We had kind of an open relationship, no steady dates. The odd little kind of one-night stand was fine. And then suddenly Time magazine came out with this incredible cover, AIDS, the killer disease. And we both went and had tests. I came back negative and he came back positive. And there was absolutely no treatment. So basically we just had to kind of keep him together until he died. He died of AIDS 30 years ago now, yeah. That was an adjustment, which you get used to, but you never get over it.
I lost incredibly close friends. And, with them, two of them died in my arms. And we were young men, and we were living our own war. We looked upon as diseased. We were certainly segregated by some.
At the beginning of the AIDS crisis, I think there was a lot of fear and people suffered enormous losses. But this is also the time when gay men were recognised as important players in some sort of public response to the epidemic. And it was the beginning of a sort of more sensible discourse about homosexuality because of how well the gay community responded to the AIDS crisis.
In the mid-1980s, female flight attendants had won equal pay. But those who had joined in the 70s still worked under contracts that required them to retire at 35 and offered limited chances for promotion. A determined group of hosties filed an anti-discrimination case against Qantas. The company contested it for 8 years. The battle went all the way to the High Court.
We had the chutzpah to get on and fight them. I don't think any of us really realised at the time how difficult it would be. But we were strong, and we were strong because we kept together and we never wavered. And we took on the big boys.
Some of the naughtier flight attendants called us the Golden Girls because we were a little older than some of the pre-existing flight attendant females, and we were around for a second try. There was another name, retreads, as in retreading tyres.
And there were a few girls that were harassed. A few girls had their cars marked as well. It wasn't pleasant in some areas, but in the end, we won, and we won big.
So proud that we banded together and we were able to go up the ladder.
Every year, on the anniversary of their victory, the Golden Girls meet with retired High Court Justice Michael Kirby. He was one of the judges who found in their favour in 1994.
Lovely to see you again.
So I've got to keep sober. I've got to launch a book on sex.
Oh, we are experts. What is so special about this group of women that keeps you coming back to celebrate with them?
They stood up for themselves. They stood up for the application of the law. Their case was a big victory for women. But the victories still must come. The young women of today have got to stand up as you stood up back 25 years ago.
My daughter's friends always say that Alex always say, did you know my mum took on Qantas and won because for discrimination? So I think in a way that we paved the way now for a lot of these women.
Cheers to the women of today for sticking together, and thank you for all your incredible work. Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers. Congratulations.
To the women of the future.
Next time, the same planes that brought the people who would reshape Australia launched Australians on the world in new ways.
Took boys up, brought men home.
Sporting groups. Some of those flights were horrific.
And high above a connected Earth, Australians dreamed of what they might become.
I am the first Euro pilot